The United Nations has its European headquarters in Geneva. In that very palace, built in the 1920s and 30s as a home for the League of Nations. In the first decade of its existence, the Council of the League had acquired a bedrock authority. Its decisions might sometimes be criticized or condemned, but nobody ignored or flaunted the Council itself. It was the peacekeeping body of the League.
Here is the press room, where sometimes as many as 400 journalists compose their messages, which are then dispatched by a special telegraph and telephone office all over the world.
The League was on the air with shortwave transmitters to carry its programs to far continents. In high optimism, the spokesmen of the military powers assembled in Geneva in February of 1932. Some were non-members of the League, like the United States, one of whose delegates was Mary Woolley.
May this conference mean a long step forward toward friendliness and goodwill among the nations and races of this world.
The disarmament conference failed, synchronously with Hitler's rise to power. He denounced the Versailles Treaty, quit the League, and started massive rearmament. Yet the first direct threat came not from Germany, but Japan. The priests bless an army leaving to conquer Manchuria, China's northernmost province. The road to World War II was open, and the first refugees in a column that was to be 40 years long trundled past the cameras. Faced with this first act of open defiance, the League met quickly to consider the seizure of Manchuria. But no government was anxious to be the first to confront the aggressor. The Assembly sent out an investigating commission to see and to report under the chairmanship of a British diplomat, Lord Lytton. By the time Lytton came back to Geneva with his report, 13 months had passed since the Japanese invasion.
We found that the Japanese occupation of this large part of China was not justified on the ground of self-defense, and that the new state which had been set up was a Japanese protectorate rather than a genuine case of Manchurian self-determination.
In Africa, Mussolini's armor was poised on the frontiers of Ethiopia, his soldiers sworn to wipe out the humiliation of Adwa, where Ethiopian tribesmen had defeated Italy in 1896. October 1935, Italy strikes at Ethiopia. The League brands Italy an aggressor, but can do little to help the retreating Ethiopians. The Council calls for economic sanctions, tries to twist Mussolini's arm with a trade embargo, but the Italian army rolls on. Within a month, civil war flared up in Spain. Soon Hitler was to snuff out Austria and Czechoslovakia after that. But with the going of Selassie, the League ended its life as a peacekeeping body. Collective security was dead. The teeth of aggression were bared, and the sword was out of the scabbard. In 1946, the last assembly of the League of Nations convened in Geneva to hand over its assets and responsibilities to the newborn United Nations. It is a generation later. Today, Edvard Hambro is in the chair at a meeting of Nobel Prize winners, and one of them is a man whose eyes had seen it all, the entire life cycle of the League and the first quarter century of the United Nations, Philip Noel Baker.
Those who said more armaments would make their nations safe only led their nations to disasters never dreamed of in human history before. Aggressive wars in Manchuria, in the Chaco, in Abyssinia, in Spain, the League's collapse, Munich, the Second War, with 17 million soldiers killed in battle, 6 million Jews gassed to death, 6 million Poles massacred by firing squads, more than 50 million human beings who lost their lives, the burning of Hamburg, of Dresden, of Tokyo, scores of thousands of little children who ran around like human torches in those hellish conflagrations till they died. The oldest fallacy in any language: if you want peace, prepare for war.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo all the way from Mexico City with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson from Oakland, California. And we are missing some of our co-hosts, wherever they are. I hope they join us next week. We are online at whatsappodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Barca. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode where we found this episode. We have merch as well. If you would like a shirt, you can contact us to our site at whatsleftpodcast.com. Thank you. All right. What is the topic, Andy?
What is the topic, Eduardo? I always introduce it, but this one is a topic you want to talk about. So I think you should introduce it.
Well, as we both know, recently there was UN talks. The 80th UN General Assembly met in New York. So I've been thinking, I told you on the phone that I thought you asked me what should we discuss this week. And I said to you, well, it's been on my mind a lot. You know, I've been listening to past episodes from other podcasts about the UN. And the UN holds, that's what we're going to be discussing if folks haven't figured it out. The UN holds sort of a very special place in my mind with regards to my background. By the way, I was listening today to the spirituality episode, which we did with Gemma, the first one we did with Gemma. And I think we should revisit some of those points there. But in that episode, I had discussed my background as a former Jehovah's Witness member, and then I started looking into Christian mythology. That's how I call it. I don't think any of it's true. Reading the King James Bible version, and looking into all these other symbols of Revelation or Apocalypse, as the last book is named. By the writer John, one of the apostles. So it's inevitable that I have to look back at my past, because you can't leave the past behind. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, some people try to overcome it, but it always haunts me. Mm-hmm. And I'm an atheist. I've played around with the word agnostic, but I've just come to realize I just should call it what it is. I don't want to be happy. Be happy for others. I should be happy for others. I don't want to be sugarcoating things for others, not making things uncomfortable for others. I'm just a staunch atheist, and sometimes I don't feel comfortable being an atheist in most spaces, because the world is driven by large institutions such as Islam, the Christian Judeo religion, and those are the main ones, but other Asian countries have other institutions. The thing is, I have an atheist look at all these things now from my childhood. So it's interesting to look back at what I used to believe in with my atheist lens.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I look forward to this discussion. I said to you, that's been on my mind, and you said we should look into it. You were intrigued. And I said, all right, well, let's look at this history, its significance, how it relates to current events, and see what we can find. And we'll pull off an episode together and see if it interests anyone.
Right. And before we start first I have some questions for you. I think when we started doing What's Left, 2018, I would have thought about you as the person who would have at least considered the some elements of the UN Charter, the idea that it's a coming together of the nations to end the scourge of war and things like that on humanity. I would have thought you would have held to some piece of that in 2018. First, is that true? And secondly, what is your view of the UN today as an institution?
Well, I mean, my 2018 self was more about voting for the lesser of two evils. The lesser, what was it? The lesser evil of
Yeah, lesser of two evils.
the lesser of two evils. So I didn't necessarily have faith in the United Nations, and with the background that I just shared, I've always had this negative view of the United Nations. But somehow I figured, well, I guess it's a good worthy cause to try to bring nations together, to try to make some resolutions and try to do something, although it's hard to do that with how many nations do we have as of states. Like right now there's 193, I think it was, I read somewhere. And so it's not like I gave in all I wasn't very the faithful loyalist UN. I saw it when I was 13 years old. I passed by when I was in New York, when I was visiting the world headquarters of the Watchtower, Track and Society. But I guess maybe a bit of my reformist self would have said some organization is helpful than not.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay. And what about today?
Over the years,
United Nations today.
Over the years, I was impacted by one of the whistleblowers that did some reporting and then later became a film. It's called The Whistleblower, about the UN's peacekeeping personnel in Ukraine that were discovered to have lots of sexual scandals. And I think those that led me to look into other financial scandals and other fraud. So I think I've been, over the years, just skeptical of what this UN Charter can do in the world. And there are major cases, reoccurring problems as well, that have not gone well, that the UN has not handled properly, such as not responding quickly to the scandals that happen in the Haiti, in the Congo, the scandal that also happened with fraud with Iraq, selling oil for humanitarian purposes. I mean, there's a list of scandals that anyone can look into. And those are the things that I, over the years, have realized, looking further into this, I don't trust the UN. On the other hand, for conventional reasons, because I've been on another podcast, like Bantercast, I've mentioned the UN. One might question, and why do you bring up the UN and quote it from time to time when you brought up Israel and Palestine? And the reason is, it's because when I talk to other people who look into mainstream news or find legitimacy in resources based on government consensus or institutions, I try to use those very same institutions and their references against them. Like, look, you're saying one thing, but then it's contrary to what you look into. These are the conventional resources you're looking into. I'll look into it as well, such as I'll do with the Constitution. I'm pointing things out of the Constitution. You say you're a constitutionalist, and here you're not falling in line or not aligning with your principles. So I have brought up the UN as references. For example, recently the UN has legitimized the genocide of Palestine. So I have mentioned that in other episodes. And again, I've said there's a reason for it, and it's because I'm trying to use the very same, very well-known institutions to the people who do believe in a government that they're upholding, such as the democracy of the United States that's being funded by, or that's ruled by the Constitution, and that does respect, I think, maybe not, the UN and other institutions. So that's the only thing I have used it for. But I don't personally find refuge in it. It's not like I find this is the place for world unity and peace and security.
And what if I said that it was, I think this might even be in our, when I think of a title, because UN is also the prefix un, and the prefix un means opposite, or the opposite of. What if I said the UN actually stood for the opposite of what it says it stands for, that it actually stands up for the carving of the world by war instead of stopping war? What do you think of that claim? And I'm going to go on and try to prove it, but I'm just curious what you think of that.
I would say what anyone else would say, which is that's not what the UN was intended for.
Okay.
That's what I mean. Like I have,
yeah, it was. And I want to start with the League of Nations.
Yeah.
The League of Nations was really started by coming after the end of the First World War. It started in 1919. And again, it was said that it was to end wars, but really it was about Britain and France carving up Europe for its own self, and it pushing Germany, the Versailles Treaty on them. League of Nations wasn't really as big as the UN at that point, but it had very much the same thing. In fact, it's very interesting. The League of, well, I'll get to where the League of Nations and how it's connected to the UN. But you know, like the UN, the League of Nations had this whole notion of being peace, but really it was about the British and the French empires managing their empire. And in fact, when anybody who even was part of the UN, like one of the first tests of whether the UN could control war was when Japan invaded Manchuria, like somewhere in the early 30s, which was really the start of World War II. They did literally nothing. They sent a delegation down there to kind of see what was happening, and after 13 months reported, hey, this doesn't look so good. But why didn't they stop Japan? Because Japan was an imperial power. It was in the League of Nations, but it itself was an imperial power that was like, you have no hold over what we're going to do. And under the same auspices, Germany started to rearm and things like that. And really, the League of Nations just collapsed after World War II, because it was not only was it shown incapable of ending peace, but really it was about managing inter-imperialist rivalry. And this, I think, the connection between the League of Nations and the UN, I thought was really interesting when I looked at how it started. So in its structure, the UN bears a close resemblance to its predecessor, the League of Nations. The UN took over the material assets of the League and imitated its organizational structure. The covenant of the League became the charter. The Council became the Security Council. The Assembly became the General Assembly. And the Permanent Court of International Justice was rebaptized as the International Court of Justice. And remember, these forms of Assembly and the General Assembly and Security Council really exposed what the true nature of the UN was, or of the League of Nations, and then later the UN, is that all the power and all the decision-making didn't rest in the General Assembly. The General Assembly was literally just a place for the big powers to hear the voices of those colonized powers, really. All the power rested in the Security Council, or represented in the early council in the League of Nations. And they could literally veto any sort of thing that came out of the General Assembly, and they could veto anything, like any member of the council, and now the Security Council, if they want to do something, they just veto it. And I think one of the earliest statements made about the UN that I think exposed, so this was from the State Department, Wallace Irwin Jr. This is in the 58. He said, "How should the United States fit into the community of sovereign nations? What form should our leadership take? Whatever the humane and statesmanlike accomplishments of the colonial era, and they are many, the option is simply not open to us." Meaning, he's saying we can't just sit there and colonize places anymore like the British did. The alternative, which is most natural to us, is that which our own American leadership since World War II has done so much to create and develop, the United Nations system. In this system, great powers looked for leadership, none more than America. And really, that kind of sentiment is what I think established the way the U.S. saw the United Nations is basically a cover in the face of colonial opposition to the British Empire and even to their own sort of stuff. It was the cover of it was a political cover for all their aggressive actions they were going to take. And you could even see it sort of in its history when folks were taught, like when this was first formed. Let's see. Okay, so in the very beginning, when this thing was formed in Yalta, Stalin pointed out that the three great powers had borne the brunt of the war. This is right after World War II, and should have the right to preserve the peace. He said it was ridiculous, and this is Stalin. It was ridiculous, he said, to believe that in the projected UN, Albania should have a voice equal to that of the big three, that being Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union. And Roosevelt agreed that unity of the big three should be one of the first aims of the UN. He proposed to give the big five, US, Britain, France, that's the Security Council, veto power in the UN Security Council. It was his view that this council alone should have the power to act, its decisions being binding on all UN members. The General Assembly, where the run-of-the-mill UN members voted, would have powers only of recommendation. If approved by two-thirds majority, only recommendation if approved by two-thirds majority. Roosevelt also proposed as a concession that the big powers should give small nations the right to bring on any of the problems before the Security Council. Stalin replied that he was interested in decisions, not in discussion. Churchill emphasized that he accepted Roosevelt's proposal only because his government could veto any undesirable act. He then tossed off this little statement. He said, "The eagle should permit the small birds to sing, but care not why they sing." At Yalta, which was a later meeting that was had after the initial San Francisco meeting, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin proceeded to carve up the world into their respective spheres of influence without any regard of the wishes of the peoples concerned, freely expressed or otherwise. Stalin got Eastern Europe, the railroads, ports of Manchuria, the Kurili Islands and southern Sakhalin. In return, Stalin promised to restrain the communist parties of Western Europe and to institute broad coalition regimes in Eastern Europe. And Korea was to be jointly occupied by Soviet and American troops. And when one person was talked about the voting that was going on in the General Assembly, this is what one person said: the introduction of voting into the conduct of foreign affairs, such as voting, occurs in the powerless assembly, however, does little more than measure the current economic and political influence of the big power on their subordinates. And so I would say that the UN has never been about peace. The UN has always been about how do the big powers, not just the United States, but mainly the United States, in terms of my understanding of things, how do they cover their violence in the globe? And the UN has been a giant cover for that. It has also served the role of being a place where both the left and the right can distract themselves from seeing the real solution of the real opponent. The left, opposing US empire, sues and goes to the UN and hopes that the UN will act and do something, without realizing that literally the US capitalists have their hand right up the ass of the UN puppet and are controlling most of that thing, right? So people go to the UN to try to get the UN to do something in the United States, but they're literally a vassal and tool of the United States. So that's a great deflection of opposition within any anti-war sentiment within the United States. On the right, which is like opposed to the UN and sees in the UN the hand of globalist control, which really is ridiculous because the UN has never been able to control anyone on the globe. They couldn't control, in the League of Nations, they couldn't control Japan and Germany. And right now you can see that the UN can't control China or Russia or United States. What has happened for the right is the right gets distracted and looks at the UN in the actions of the UN as if it's the UN that's coming in to control them and restrict their independence, and saying, don't take away our sovereignty and don't take the sovereignty of our state. And what that does for the US state is it basically, for any right-wing opposition, basically shields them from seeing who is really going to crack down on their sovereignty. It's not going to be the UN. It's going to be its own US state. So I think the UN has actually been a great source, a great illusionist to cause both the left to have illusions in the UN doing something for peace, and for the right, and as a boogeyman for the right to make them think that their actual enemy is not sitting right inside their own house that exists. It exists somewhere out there. And of course, like Agenda 2030 shows, the UN still throws forward proposals that give each state cover to come in and do something, and say, "Oh, we have to do this because this is part of an international agreement." But really, what you're seeing is an international body that is a plaything of the imperialist powers, mostly the United States, but it can also be used by China and Russia, sometimes by Britain and France as well. That's what I think the UN is, and that's why I call it really a kind of it's like the table around which the gangsters sit when they're trying to figure out how to carve up the globe, and whether they can agree to the carve up or whether they're going to have to take a different road because they can't agree to the carve up. And so there's nothing peaceful about that. It's where the mob bosses all meet to figure out how they're going to fleece us. That's how I look at the UN.
Yeah. There are some on the left that would say, like during the South Africa and apartheid during 1970s and 1980s, that the UN General Assembly repeatedly passed votes in order to pressure governments to call for sanctions and boycotts, which ultimately isolated the South African government so that they could pressure them to change or reform. So
would you
those
agree
are some
that
of
that's
the arguments.
because the U.S. was no longer?
Yeah. What do you mean? Say it again.
Would you see that the U.S. no longer had a role in holding up South African apartheid, that it was prepared to let that go? Because you can see that when you can see what it's able to do in Israel, you can really see that mostly this is a question of choice, not the UN actually being able to, it did something there. No.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah. Well, it's different. The matter was taken differently with regards to Palestine and Israel. And I think that that's what shows the difference between two nations being considered to have states that are enacting apartheid, that are discriminating against others. And then you have that force and the impact on South Africa, but you don't see it on Israel because of course it's an ally, or it's an extension of the US.
Yeah.
Military power.
Yep.
So I mention that because I have had discussions with people from leftist circles, and they will say, well, what about this, or the impact on climate change, or the Palestinian recognition in 2012, or the condemnation of Russia and annexation of Crimea in 2014. And it's exactly what you just called out, which is the difference in the way that it responds to Israel versus South Africa, which shows its selectiveness.
I think that the stuff around climate change is another example of how the UN, with the Agenda 2030, which is an agenda of centralizing control, it's just not an agenda of centralizing control in the hands of the so-called globalists who are behind the UN. It's going to be a cover that allows all the big powers to push an agenda in their own country in the name of some humanitarian thing. If you look at the Agenda 2030, it's like diversity, inclusiveness, fighting poverty, fighting
zero hunger, quality education, gender equality, clean water, sanitation.
Right. But when you look at what they're asking, what's going to have to happen, it's always we're going to have to do these tough measures, and it always is giving the states, the member states, particularly the Security Council member states, that is United States, China, Russia, Britain, and France, the exact justification for coming in and saying, we're not just doing this because we have to do it, we're doing this for the globe. And it's not. It's for actually control. It's for building the digital network or what is it? The kind of digital prison, basically, we've been describing. It's all those things in the name of fighting climate, in the name of fighting poverty, and really, it's just and you can really see it because China has actually been much more successful at bringing the new Green New Deal than the United States. And even those who believe that, and the reason I would say that the UN is not just a tool for the United States, but potentially going to be a tool for China and Russia, is it's very interesting when China and Russia were making their bipartisan agreement in February, just before the Russian invasion, they were very clear that they were offering their leadership to the UN, like basically proposing that they would be the actual best leaders, like in terms of trying to give everyone a space, like respecting the rights of all nations and things like that. Definitely saying that the old order, Britain, France, United States, had given that up. They had become tyrannical. And it's clear to me that China sees the UN as exactly the kind of vehicle that they'll need to push their global agenda and their hegemonic control, the same way the United States has used it. So there is no possibility of that multipolar world that maybe some people think could become manifest when China and Russia emerge as peer competitors to the United States, and maybe they can meet at the UN and come to some agreement. No, China and Russia plan on using the UN as exactly the kind of tool that as it was used by Britain and then later by the United States after World War II. And then if we survive World War III, I think if this thing's around, they're either going to use the United Nations, or like World War III, we'll have a new league that will end the scourge of war, and it will be controlled by China. And again, the reason I say this is because the world is really run by capitalism, not by the UN, not by the United States, not by China. It is run by the needs of profits. And that is going to push that competition all the time. So there is not a possibility. Like the UN is an impossibility under capitalism. And it largely is used as a smokescreen and a way of basically confusing working people about what's really possible under this system.
So we would discuss World War III on our What's Left episodes, and I have listened to a few back episodes, and you have made other predictions. The United Nations is, how do you see it fit into some of its role play into what's happening with the areas that are now being, I think I would label the three fronts, or two biggest fronts actually, by the Pacific and and Middle Eastern front, which I would say like Asia area with Russia. Because you haven't mentioned it in its role in any of the World War III events, but I hear folks saying how the impact on the recent ceasefire that was also just finished this week, the UN did play a role to stifle or to try to prevent from Palestine being taken over.
Well, no, I mean, first of all, the agreement that's been reached is not good for the Palestinians. It's basically a ceasefire. It's not a peace agreement. It's a ceasefire. U.S. troops are coming into that region now. Like, basically, it's just bringing the U.S. directly into the war against the Palestinians, and in a place where they can actually have ground troops to move forces into other parts of the Middle East. It's not like them trying to say, "Oh, we got to end this." And the reason this agreement is reached is not because the UN built pressure. I want to be clear: the UN has no pressure to do anything to stop any of the major powers, not just the United States, but China and Russia as well. None, zero. The only thing that can stop China or Russia would be the United States. It won't be the UN, and that's what got exposed under the League of Nations. That's why the League of Nations collapsed in the face of World War II, because it had been shown to be completely pointless, and a new world was being rearranged. And so, with new masters in power, they wanted to build a new order that would allow them to be put in power instead of the British. And that was the United States order that was going to be largely established prior to World War II, and then using the UN as partly a tool for its control, and then as partly a way of making deals with the Soviet Union until the Cold War came, and then a new arrangement was established. And the UN was seen as a way of stopping communism, actually, and the spread of communism. I'll find this quote that I saw here. Let's see. Oh yeah, this was from this Henry Cabot Lodge. He was a Louisville, Kentucky representative. And he was talking about the wonders of the UN, which was essentially, he said, the UN had brought about the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Iran. It was ending the communist aggression by civil war against Greece. Above all, giving material and moral backing to the United States and the Republic of Korea in stopping Red aggression in Korea, focusing world opinion on Red China in 1955, so effectively that it resulted in the release of our 15 American flyers. They had gotten some soldiers, airplane pilots captured, and in exposing and frustrating communist designs in places as far apart as Guatemala and Formosa. Finally, 35 times in the past 4 years, and this is he's talking about the UN, we led the United Nations in the rejection of the attempt to seat communist China. Thus, in its first decade, the United Nations proved its effectiveness again and again and again, and even secured some gain against the supposedly immovable empire of world communism. So I think what's going to happen, and as the world uncoils towards World War III, is I do think the UN is going to be more and more exposed as something that is like pointless and useless as any sort of means of holding anything back. But it will continue to be used to throw sand in our eyes and to make it seem like a possible place that we could end these wars is somewhere in that fairyland of the UN. And if the working class believes that the tooth fairy is going to save them from war, then the working class is not taking up the only thing that will save them from global war, which is class war against their capitalist oppressors. That's it. If you believe in the tooth fairy, you don't fight for your own liberation. And so that's, I think, the role the UN they'll try to play, but the UN is going to dissolve in front of us in the coming 5 to 10 years as World War III advances. That's because that's what's happened with the League of Nations.
I was looking at some of the other moments in history where it has also been biased, Middle Eastern conflicts, for example. But it's not just been that way with the Cold War biases, but also with conflicts in Africa as well, when certain African nations were aligned with some of the more imperialist countries. And so, for example, the UN acted selectively depending on geopolitical and economic interest. In the 1990s, the UN intervened militarily in Kuwait, but had limited action in Rwanda or Srebrenica, I think that's how you pronounce it, 1995, despite evident mass atrocities. And this was all because of strategic political interests of major powers rather than humanitarian concerns alone. I'm just feeding more to the evidence as to why I think that you're right. I mean, it does show that there have moments where it doesn't intervene for humanitarian causes as it is portrayed, or the principles state it should. Rather, it's strategically looking for how it will align with the more major powers. And also, I was looking at how Iraq faced years of heavy sanctions in the 1990s.
Yeah.
But for the same reasons, other Middle Eastern countries, for the very same reasons that the other were criticized, other Middle Eastern countries were criticized, they did not face those same sanctions.
Right.
So I'm just pointing out as well with my compiled list here, my notes, how it's also not aiming for neutrality, as it appears though to be this moral compass in the world. Right. So I wanted to read though this Revelation 13 from the King James Bible, but I don't know if you had something to say to what I had mentioned.
No, just that the UN will, even though the UN is powerless, it will continue to act as a good distraction to both the left and the right from, and hide the real threat that exists behind UN, and that real threat is the capitalist state. And that's what I do believe it has served a very good role to hide the mailed fist of the capitalist state around a velvet glove of the UN.
I will break down this belief that Jehovah's Witnesses believe in, Right, so I will read from the King James Version, not the Jehovah's Witness Bible, but the King James Version. That's most widely accepted. This is from Revelation 13. Revelation 13, 14 through 18. So this is Revelation or Apocalypse 13, 1 through 18, but I'm going to only read 14 through 18. It's heavy symbolic language I will break down.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go.
And this is related to the UN?
Yes.
Okay.
This is related to the UN because the UN represents, it's according to the prophecies here, this is where the UN fits in.
Gotcha.
Did you want to mention, is this some way, I was trying to make, did you want to mention something else?
No. You're good. Let's go.
And deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast. So this image to the beast, there's a beast here, which represents world kingdoms, an image to the beast, which represents the United Nations, or the League of Nations at first, and then the United Nations, according to this Christian belief, which had the wound by a sword and did live. And he had power to give life. This beast had life unto the image of the beast, that the image of this beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So if you do not worship the image of the beast, you should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand, or in their foreheads. The mark is your allegiance. What sign is their allegiance to this image of the beast and to the world kingdoms, the beast itself? And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666, otherwise 666. All right, lots of figurative language in there. I'm going to stop sharing here. All right, so I'm going to break down a bit why all this discussion had to do with my background, because in Revelation, there's other scriptures in there, but I read that main one. There is a two-horned beast which represents the Anglo-American world power, according to Christians. It had been said by Jehovah's Witnesses way before, a long time, right? Like after World War One. And the two-horned beast represents the Anglo-American world power, which is Britain and the UK and the USA. UK and the US. And they tell him to make an image to the wild beast. And Jehovah's Witnesses understand that as the world political powers forming an international organization patterned after their own governments, which is the United Nations, something that looks like the political system. The image, it's not the beast. And they believe this prophecy was fulfilled when, after World War I, the Allied powers proposed the League of Nations in 1919 to preserve peace. And after World War II, the League was revived and renamed the United Nations. So for them, the image of the wild beast isn't some physical creature at all, but it is this international political institution. And one day, it'll come down, and it'll just be destroyed. And this political institution will be destroyed so that one day it could be established world peace, security, actual security by the kingdom of God. So I grew up thinking that in Revelation, I didn't read all of it, but I grew up thinking there's a seven-headed beast, all world political powers through history. There's a two-horned beast, which is in the form of a lamb, which is to deceive you, a two-horned beast, but Anglo-American world power. Those are the two strongholds of the world, which decide a lot on world political affairs. And then there's the image of the beast, the United Nations, which was a successor of the League of Nations. So these are the things that keep me up at night and haunt me and give me nightmares about the world coming to an end, because apparently these are the reasons why the United Nations exists, because it's not actually security, it's actually a way to give this idea of security and peace, but it's really controlled, the United Nations controlled by this seven-headed beast, which is to dominate and destroy and to control humankind.
Apparently, I'm Jehovah's Witness. I mean, honestly, like, that's much closer to the truth than certainly what most liberals think about the UN. And it's closer to the truth, I think, than even the right wing sees in the UN, because I think in that thing, it understands that the UN is an image. It's not the actual beast itself. So ironically, you know, as you become more an atheist, you're pushing me towards either Christianity or Jehovah's Witness.
I'm going to show images, but I'll just share this
Oh,
one.
yeah.
So we have Revelation beast.
I like that. I'm glad you shared that.
There's more, but for now, it's just
Put it out in doses, man. You're slowly bringing me over to the Jehovah's Witness side. Oh, wow, cool.
so. These are the images. So this is a seven-headed beast. This is the oval that represents the kingdoms.
Okay.
And it gives. There is no actual symbolic structure because the Bible didn't know what it would look like apparently. But the future of this image of the beast, now we know, according to many Christians, that it is the United Nations. But this seven-headed beast here gives breath, gives life to United Nations.
Mm.
So this is what it represents. And then there is the two-horned lamb revelation.
Oh, yeah.
Which tells you that there's two kingdoms that are going to be making basically going to make all of the decisions in world affairs, and it has to do with the UK and the US. Apparently, those are the ones that are supposed to be making most of the decisions on world affairs.
Well, that's certainly, in some ways, that's better than some of the Christian nationalists who, see in these things, the establishment of Israel and, the apocalypse and things like that. I actually feel like, I mean, look, people should believe whatever they believe and whatever their thing is. But if you ask me, that this story seems closer to what's going on in the world than the people who are like, we need Israel to be successful and become the Jewish homeland because then Jesus will come down.
Yeah. This is the sort of stuff that my mother. These were the stories that my mother told me as a kid, and scared the hell out of me.
Well, tell your mom I agree. Tell her that I had on a recent What's Left episode, Andy agreed with your Jehovah's Witness stuff you shared with me.
I'll tell her. Anyhow, but so I think what I'm gathering as we might conclude, because I think this is a very good short episode and it was light and it was good for this Sunday evening, is that my not evolving, because I've always thought of the United Nations as not being a very good institution, but it's only given me further understanding and doubt on this institution, after especially the revelations of the scandals that I said that I might link to in videos. Let's see if I find something that I'll just putting there, and as well as the things that you're mentioning, like the anti-communism, and as well as what you mentioned that happened with Japan and how it did not interfere when it was supposed to be a League of Nations that was supposedly to control the wars that were happening. I didn't see that one, but I did see the other ones where it was having biases and it had minimal impact on other conflicts around the world that did not intervene for economic and political interest, because major powers like
Mm-hmm.
the ones we mentioned, the veto powers, did not have a lot to say in how they intervene.
Yep.
Just shows how the United Nations isn't actual institution of peace and security, but rather a forfeit or an illusion.
Yeah, I believe so.
But I have had people tell me, as with, like, they'll bring up South Africa, that it has an impact and should be respected, and it's a legitimate institution and has a place in our government, and also brings together international law and judiciary powers, which, by the way, in speaking to that arm or that branch, are quite selective with who they bring to trial as well, because it's always been countries of the global south, using that term just colloquially,
Yeah.
but not nations who have actually brought crimes on at a large scale, such as the conflicts in the world in the Middle East. And you've never seen anyone put to trial George W. Bush or Obama.
No. Nope.
So that arm is not unbiased to your term of the anti.
Correct. Right. And those cases where the UN suddenly loses its principles and doesn't, like, it stands over for something right here, but doesn't do it over there. Those are not throwaway cases. They expose that the UN itself has no consistent interest. So you have to look elsewhere to understand why it does what it does. So those, and, maybe the UN actually might have done positive something one place, but if it did, it was probably like sold over and over again to actually do the job of hiding the evil that it like the image of the beast, that behind the image of the beast is the actual beast. And so it performs a better role of being the image of the beast with any little minor thing it does. But honestly, I'll bet you if you look deeply into those, even in those so-called good things, there's going to be some sort of mischief.
Mm.
I'll bet you. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just. But
such as the humanitarian aid that was being poured into Iraq with oil.
That's right.
Surely there was a lot of corruption happening there with regards to briberies and all kinds of scandals with where the money was going. But I mean, I was convinced already. But Andy, one thing I'm constantly wondering is if we had a revolution happen to just have isolated self-governing societies in which we'd have to convene somehow and be united in some way. There'd be some form of United Nations. I was thinking about this as I was washing the dishes today. I was thinking, even though I don't have faith in this institution, we live in a global society. We'd have to somehow be interconnected some way or another. There would be some established communication, alliance, dare I say, assembly, or I can't even use,
my belief is that nations are a creature of a construct of capitalism. So I don't think there'll be a quote United Nations, but I suspect that there'll be need for cross global collaboration. I suspect. I don't know. Not that they will be armies against each other, but maybe people actually, maybe the produce that's made locally will stay local, and I won't be that, like, you just get bananas everywhere around the globe. Maybe people who eat bananas will be near the bananas, and people who eat oranges will be near the oranges, and people who eat potatoes will be near the potatoes. Like, maybe people will actually just consume what is around them and not be all trying to dance all over the globe, trying to move this and that so they can have their bananas from Mexico in New York or San Francisco. I don't know. I'm not going to speak to that because in no way, but I just think there's a lot that we have today. Like, look, the Palace of Versailles is beautiful. but that is a construct of feudal oppression. Like, we don't need those gardens, like, it's, I don't know what the world will be like. But I do believe that the struggle for liberation will require solidarity across national boundaries. What sort of association it requires of us after people liberate themselves from their immediate oppressors, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, since you mentioned food, by the way, I was just looking into the 2030 agenda, and there is reliance on heavily on big data and statistics and AI tools, which, under the guise of trying to make progress so that there could be satellite imagery and AI to track deforestation and urban growth, or machine learning for predicting crop yields and disease outbreaks. But all that is not, I mean, that's what being said, but will actually be used to spy and to gather data and to be able to
and they're
those
going to
wars on the outside of the globe.
And all that AI stuff is going to build huge data centers that are energy consuming and water consuming, things, because they just hide. It's like, it's bullshit that any of that means anything other than people having to make do with less so that our rulers can consume more.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned food, so I just thought about that in a moment. So anyhow, but I would imagine when we discuss another sort of military strategic document, such as we did with sequencing, was it sequencing? Right?
Yeah.
I imagine that we'll look into 2030 agenda as well and its relevance with the United Nations when we talk about any of those events that's happening currently, because I see them all just kind of extensions.
And some of the elements of 2030 are breaking up, at least in the West, as the bite of the need to remilitarize and rearm. They are finding is in contradiction to some of the quote sustainability goals. They're not going to let sustainability goals get in the way of building tanks and drones and things like that. So some of those things are being rethought of, particularly in the fact since the access to the raw materials that they need for those things is more dominated by China and Russia now. So I think that 2030 document is an aspiration for global capitalism, and that each of the capitalists is racing to try to use it for its own aims to control its own population. I think China has advanced the farthest on that project, and I'm kind of thinking, actually, and you can see it in some ways in the language of BlackRock, which is sort of moving away from some of the sustainability goals that they talked about. I get the sense that U.S. capital is going to move away from those things.
So these terms are being used to sort of ask or give permission to enter.
Yep. Or ultimately to not get permission, but to say you have to do it because this is for the sake of the globe, and we're making things better for the world, which is a lie again. But
yeah, which reminds me, by the way, another thing that one more thing, we don't have to include this, but I was thinking as I start to look into other institutions that hold weight or try to give legitimacy to, is to people, to ruling, to the ruling class. I was thinking about the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh my God, what a fiasco! Like, nothing.
Go ahead, say your reaction.
I think it's that woman from Venezuela. Like, it's like literally, basically, an invitation to invade Venezuela on the United States. Like, so disgusting.
I was just thinking, because I'm so for the Venezuelan movement that's happening, but their desire, their conflict with Maria Corina is to want her to liberate Venezuela, but depending on the U.S. state to intervene, and it's just the Nobel Peace Prize being given to her, and then she making homage to Trump,
Exactly.
whoever is in power, but giving homage to the US state so that you could encourage them to help you, to aid them in their struggle, which is such a bad idea.
No.
I just thought, oh God. But I think this was tied to how I think about now ceremonies, institutions, places of power that are not necessarily governments, but the image of the beast, or the
Yeah.
image or reflection to these governments that governments give legitimacy to.
I think it's good that you included that last point on the Nobel Peace Prize, because I've been thinking the UN is like the image of the beast for a long time, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Quite some time. But I wouldn't have necessarily put the Nobel Peace Prize in that zone. I would have said, it's just these rich people doing whatever. And yeah, maybe there's something to it. They're honoring some scientist or honoring some whatever person. But boy, it was never so clear to me after this that the Nobel Peace Prize is completely illegitimate. It was this year, and for that reason, it must be illegitimate for all the previous years. That there was had nothing to do with peace. That's all I can tell you. Those peace prizes obviously had nothing to do with peace.
Yeah.
So,
and it's unfortunate Maria Corina Machado is the only option I think the Venezuelan class struggle has supported and poured themselves into, because it'll be quite the opposite of what's going to be happening,
they're going to
because
be
she's inviting a bigger beast.
yes, they're going to be a proxy. They're going to be a proxy. Like that really worked well for Ukraine.
Right. So I hope, maybe we'll touch on this in some other time, that people wake up to these peace-driven institutions that are not really calling for peace.
Yeah. I mean, I have a question, but maybe this is another episode of how she is perceived in Venezuela. Like, is she and that other presidential candidate who lost the election, are they even considered legitimate within Venezuela?
They are.
Yeah.
Well, there was a corruption scandal where last year he did not win,
Right.
but it said that it was rigged, so then he won suddenly out of nowhere. Maduro, who is currently the president of Venezuela, but she is seen as the face of liberation.
Wow.
And I have been around, so many Venezuelans, and I try to have honest discussions with them. But this is what happens, Andy. It's like you have a dictator that was put there by the U.S. Then you have someone coming from, like Hugo Chavez, coming to the rescue. But then you give them all this power, and then they abuse that power, and then they leave a legacy, which became Maduro, and then people are sick of him because that's authoritarianism. That's what, and then you're just going to support anyone who's in the opposition, no matter how she does, or doesn't have to be a woman. In this case, it is, however she does it. And in this case, she's calling for the troops from the USA to come in.
Yeah, well, good luck with
that.
And
that's why I think the discussion we had about El Salvador with Bukele is also a Trojan horse, because you have people in El Salvador thinking, oh, he cleared up all the gangs on the streets, but then he's oppressing everyone else.
Yeah.
Freedom of speech, and you're losing all kinds of rights.
Yeah.
So I understand people's frustration, the Venezuelan people. I understand that they are just wanting to get rid of by any way, any means, but this does not.
There are no shortcuts.
Yes.
There are no shortcuts.
No shortcuts.
Whatever you're trying to do.
Yes.
That's reality.
And make that be a lesson for all of us.
Yep.
That even with either Biden or Trump picking the lesser of two evils, which is how we started this episode as well, when you asked me about 2018, there's just no shortcuts. We can't rely on a Democrat or a Republican, since we're talking to this American audience, And you can't rely on the opposition just because.
Xi Jinping, you
Yes.
can't rely on any of these people. None of them are taking you anywhere you want to go.
Exactly. So whether it's in Venezuela or in the US or in the UK, voting for the opposite candidate, voting for the opposite person, voting for the one that's going to do less harm isn't actually the solution. Yeah. And I've had to learn that the hard way, even throughout my evolution, my political evolution. So, yeah. So anyhow,
I'm glad you brought up that Nobel Peace Prize. That was gross.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog on whatsthepodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes, Podcast, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog, any of those links in the episode notes or wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, so that Andy doesn't pick my brain and then have me revisit childhood traumas, contact us through our blog and suggest something then. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson, and thank you all for listening. Check us out for the next episode. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.